Welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche of the LaRouche Organization. We are involved, as I think people know, in a day of action today. This is worldwide, and our focus was specifically around Afghanistan and the releasing of the funds of the approximately $8 to $9 billion being held of the government of Afghanistan by primarily the Treasury Department of the United States, also the IMF and World Bank, and other related institutions actually in Europe. We apparently have a reason to believe that the State Department today has reiterated its policy to not release those funds. We'll hear more about that and other such matters when we get into our briefing. I'll also just indicate that for those of you that might have been involved in that day of action today, we would ask you to get into the queue when we get to that part of the presentation to give us some report, whatever report or reflections you have on what happened today. Press *6 to do that. And what we are going to do is go right to Dennis Small with a little preface from me. What's been happening for the past week is that there's a kind of comeuppance that reality is beginning to bonk the transatlantic world with. It's come out in various forms, and for example, the China government, the Prime Minister of China, made it clear that at this point, China is not intending to try to abide by the dictates of, although they're fantastic dictates, of this sort of Green Deal mafia globally. They're not going to try to fulfill the coal requirements, coal reduction, CO2 emissions reduction requirements related to coal. President Vladimir Putin is wondering whether he's going to attend. I don't think that means that we know that the Russians are planning not participate, but we also know that from the nation of India, which is the second largest consumer of coal in the world, they have been clear for months that they have serious questions about the entire conception of the COP26 Glasgow, Scotland set of initiatives, if you want to call them that. Meanwhile, the royals and others are making statements which are sort of almost Romanov-like in their detachment from reality, with Prince William talking today about how people should not be going into space, but there should be an Earth shot, not a moon shot, trying to talk about how wonderful his father was and how prescient he was, Prince Charles, that is, the weird and wacky Prince Charles. So there's a kind of a comeuppance with reality. Britain noted, some people in Britain noted that the British response to COVID, in which they had attempted to talk about herd mentality, was sort of, they didn't use the word inhuman. They simply said it was grossly wrong, and they talked about how the approach is coming out of China, or out of what they called Asia and Southwest Asia, was far superior to what happened out of the transatlantic world. But with that said, it doesn't mean that reality is going to prevail. You have a Malthusian outlook, and that Malthusian outlook is not merely toward other nations. It's also something that's infected the transatlantic world itself, the United States and various countries of Europe. And therefore, there's a kind of detachment that is self-destructive and even suicidal. And in order for that to be turned off and turned around, something new has to appear on the horizon. Now, that something new is something that actually has been being written about by this organization and acted upon by this organization for well over 45 years. And sometimes that comes through candidacies. I'll note that 45 years ago, there was an election in 1976, and at that time, we were running a third party, U.S. Labor Party. We had candidates for Congress and Senate in Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Washington, Michigan, all over the country, wherever we were. And we were doing that in tandem with Lyndon LaRouche. And this is not a campaign for votes. This was a campaign to put forward what we called the International Development Bank. It was an idea of a complete alternative to what the institutions of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund were putting forward. And similar to the situation we see right now with Afghanistan and what is being asserted as what should be transatlantic policy, that madness has to be directly opposed by a force which is vigorous, insightful, insouciant, irreverent, and happy about its role. There will be some other things we'll reference. There was a statement that came out from Schiller Institute, which we'll probably refer to during the course of things, which sort of exemplifies that, co-written by Chris Burkhout of the Netherlands, the initiator and co-founder of what's called the CLINTEL, or Climate Intelligence Group, and Helga LaRouche, founder and head of the Schiller Institute. So there's a lot going on. We want to get right into what that is. But what we're going to do is we're going to begin with Dennis Small giving us the briefing, international perspective, and then we'll go into some reports and reflections on what has happened today. So, Dennis?
Okay, good. Thanks a lot. The topic that I want to address, because I think it goes to the heart of the explanation of the cause behind the other things happening in different areas, is the hyperinflation and depression, which is now exploding around the planet, to look at its cause and, of course, its cure. I'm going to do this by describing a couple of key situations. I'm sure you've all heard the reports in the press of how what really causes inflation is supply or demand effects. If the supply drops or the demand increases, that's supposedly what causes prices to increase, and so on and so forth. You can read about this in all the textbooks on economics. You can go to Harvard authors, and they'll basically tell you the things that there are two kinds of inflation. There's cost push inflation, there's demand pull inflation, all of which is a bunch of poppycock. It's simply absolutely not true. The situation we're facing is a lot more stark than that. If you were to wake up tomorrow morning or Monday morning of next week and find that you could not get any money out of the ATM machine, and that when you thought that it was just a broken ATM machine on the corner, and when you went to the bank, the doors of the bank were closed, and then you went to another bank and there were policemen in front of it and crowds gathering. When you went to the drugstore to buy your medicine that you need for your urgent cardiac condition or high blood pressure medicine or what have you, the pharmacy is not open, or else it has supplies which are being rationed out in tiny doses. Would that sort of a situation concern you? You may think that I'm exaggerating and that this is just sort of a hyperbolic situation, an exaggeration of what's going on, but it is not, because this is exactly the barrel that we're staring down at this moment. And I think that after I finish reviewing a few situations, a half dozen situations internationally, I think you will realize that this evaluation, which is Lyndon LaRouche's evaluation as to the systemic nature of this crisis, is actually far more accurate than anything anyone else is saying, and that therefore it points us in the direction of a solution. If you look at 2021 and look at what's been happening with certain prices, which are always explained away in the media as the result, again, of supply and demand, the price of cotton has risen 47% over the course of this year. Is that because there has been a 50% increase in the demand for cotton? That many more people want shirts, or you have to get cotton for other purposes? The index price of fertilizers has risen to the point where it is double what it was 1 year ago. It's not a 47% increase, it's an 100% increase. Is that because all of a sudden nobody is producing any fertilizer anymore, and therefore the supply dropped, and so the price doubled in a year? Let's look at the energy situation in the United States and then in Europe. The cost of oil in the United States is, since the beginning of 2021, is 65% higher than it was The price for Brent crude is about $83 now. It's the highest in years. But that's only a 65% increase. The cost of natural gas in the United States has risen 112% this year. So we're talking about an increase of these basic energy inputs, oil and natural gas, of an increase of 1.5 to 2 times over less than a year. Is that because the OPEC stopped producing oil all of a sudden? That the 1% drop in oil production, I'm just making that number up, but it doesn't make much difference, that 1% drop in the supply of oil has led to a doubling of its price and 100% increase in its price? We are told that we are rebounding so rapidly from the COVID pandemic and that production is just whizzing along in many parts of the world, and therefore the cost of electricity has doubled? I mean, do they really think we're that foolish? Maybe they do. In Europe, the cost of megawatt hour of electricity, I'm switching units here because these are just the sample numbers that we have, but I think you'll get the idea. The cost of a megawatt hour of electricity on average in Europe, December of last year, of 2020, was 43 euros. In March of this year, it had more than doubled to 100 euros. And as of today, October 2021, the average cost of a megawatt hour of electricity in Europe is 389 euros. It has risen from 43 to 389 in less than a year. That's a tenfold increase. Has there been a tenfold increase in the demand for electricity? Has there been a tenfold collapse of the supply of electricity? One starts to wonder, maybe this doesn't have anything to do actually with supply and demand and other fairy tales. Citibank has issued a projection of where things are going to stand by the end of this year in terms of the situation in Europe, and they're saying that the cost of millions of BTUs, British thermal units, will rise to a level of anywhere between $30 and $100 per million BTUs. Again, I apologize for the switching around of units, but the Citibank itself does a conversion of this. They say if $100 per million BTUs is hit, that's the equivalent of a barrel of oil costing $580 per barrel. It's now breaking the roof at 83. And this is a projection for what could be happening by the end of this year. Break it down into specific situations. Italy, the cost of electricity, people's electricity bills are going to be increasing by as much as 900% by Christmas time, according to Italian accounts. Is that because people are consuming 900% more electricity? Give me a break. In Spain, the megawatt hour of electricity rose from 40 euros in 2020 to 200 euros now, a 5-fold increase. India, which uses a large amount of coal, as Dennis was just reporting a moment ago, imports a large amount of their coal from Indonesia. The cost of a ton of coal imported from Indonesia has risen from $86 per ton in April of 2021, this year. In the 6 months since then, till today, it has gone from $86 per ton to $162 per ton. It has doubled in 6 months. Half of the coal plants in India have less than a 2-day supply of coal on hand. They may run out and stop producing electricity. In Lebanon, this is already happening. It's lights out in Lebanon. The 2 major electricity companies, government electricity companies, which produce the majority of the electricity in the country, have been forced to shut down. The drop in electricity supplies has been so drastic that they are estimating that there is an immediate danger to the actual integrity, the engineering integrity of the grid itself. And this has everything to do with the IMF policies and banking policies imposed upon them. Now, you might be beginning to get the idea that none of this is explained by all the reasons which are provided. It so happens that the cost of energy is not determined by supply and demand, not cost push inflation or demand pull inflation. The cost of energy is determined on the Amsterdam spot market. It's a speculative spot market. And when speculators jump into it and start speculating on the future price that they will be able to sell their barrel of oil or their kilowatt of electricity or what have you, then you know damned well that people are going to withhold the supply that they may have on hand because they know that the price is going up according to the speculative markets. So if you have a speculative market which is fed by countless trillions and a quadrillion and some of dollars, this is going to drive the price of everything up as this speculative feeding frenzy goes ahead, which is why you have a situation across all areas where you have these massive increases in prices. It has nothing to do with supply and demand or rebounding from the pandemic, which isn't happening, going on anywhere. And that's energy. That's one major sector. Let's look at another major sector which affects everything that occurs everywhere else in the economy, as happens with energy. Let's take the case of cargo, shipping things around the world. The basic unit for shipping is a container, which is known as a TEU, a 20-foot equivalent unit. And the cost per TEU of shipping from the United States to China, each one of these units, was about $2,000 1 year ago. Today, if you can find one of these things, the cost is $20,000. It's a tenfold increase in 1 year because there's all of a sudden a shortage of TEUs. The cost of shipping from Chile in South America to the United States, the TEU unit to ship, which was $1,500 a year ago, is now $18,000. This is a 12-fold increase. Chips. 90% of the world's supply of electronic chips, not potato chips, electronic chips, are produced by one company in Taiwan. There are reports in the technical media dealing with the chip industry that there is documentation that substantially more supplies of chips are being shipped to companies than are being released or issued in the product of those companies. More in than out. What does that tell you? People are hoarding. So you have, why would hoarding be going on? Because there is speculation on the price of chips. An engineer colleague of ours in Mexico reported on a recent phone call, an organizing call just like this one that we had with supporters of our movement in Mexico. He's an expert in the field of plastics and petrochemical plastics and so on. And he was ashen-faced, reporting that the cost of PVC tubing has gone up, again, the units are a little different, from 28 pesos just a few months ago to 60 pesos, more than a doubling. He said the cost of aluminum is fourfold more than it was before, but it can't be found and bought. There is no aluminum to be had. There is no steel to be had. The cost of shipping cargo to China from Mexico or back, 2 times what it was. They can't even import stuff from China for that reason. And you may be interested to know that there is a spot market on cargo, just as there is on energy. It's not a question of going to the corner and going to the 7-Eleven and saying I need 2 or 6,000 TEUs. No, it's bid on a speculative market. And there are 3 major shipping companies around the world that have the corner on this market, and it works exactly the way all raw material markets work, which is not supply and demand. It's a speculative spot market, a forward market. So let's say you have in your possession, or you have bid to have delivery in your possession of 10,000 TEUs. There's no way in the world you're going to rent those out at a mere $20,000 today, when you have every reason to believe that 3 months down the line, you can make a killing at 30,000. So you're going to withhold that from the market. So you have an inbuilt speculative process going on here. Now, this isn't the cause of the crisis, because what's happening is not price inflation. What I just described to you isn't what's going on. What's going on is that there is a massive shock devaluation of the value and the worth of the United States dollar. That's why the dollar, being the unit of measure internationally, other than the places that have been driven out of it, like China or Russia increasingly, or other countries, Iran and so forth, but with the dollar being the international currency, reserve currency, when the dollar no longer can buy what it did before, this takes the form of drastic increases in prices. A twofold increase, a fourfold increase, a tenfold increase, a threefold increase. What's happening is the dollar is being turned into the used toilet paper it has in fact been increasingly for the past 30, 40 years, exactly as Lyndon LaRouche described. And that's why it's very possible that we will all wake up one morning, very possibly in the fourth quarter of this year, and find that you can't buy anything for love or money, especially not money. Love might work, but the dollar is not going to be worth anything. You cannot find anything to buy. You will get runs on banks. You will get runs on ATMs. Paper money will disappear. It will go up in smoke. The $1.8 quadrillion of speculative assets will go up in smoke in the form of the equivalent of a financial nuclear chain reaction. Right? A nuclear chain reaction does not go like dominoes falling down. One knocks the other, knocks the other, knocks the other. That's not how it works. One blows out two, two blows out four, four blows out 16, et cetera, et cetera. It's a chain reaction. And that's what we are seeing signs of going on in the world today. Now, the cause of this is not the speculation per se. The cause of this is systemic. The cause of this is explained by Lyndon LaRouche's triple curve function, which I'm going to, of necessity, assume that most of you are familiar with, since we don't have a screen to show it on or for you to look at. If you don't know what it is, look it up. LaRouche's triple curve, or his typical collapse function, which describes the process of what happens in an economy as an interlinked single function, which includes, on the one hand, monetary and financial aggregates and their rate of growth, which are increasing hyperbolically, as we've seen, as against a physical economic process of the actual physical economic requirements of a society, which is plunging. And LaRouche repeatedly explained that the triple curve, he didn't call it the three curves, it is a single function. It is a single interrelated function, which is not arithmetic, it's not geometric, it's not hyperbolic, because the physical economic process is a non-linear process, either of growth, where you have technological leaps, where you have discontinuities because of advances in technology, or, in the alternative, in a collapse, it is also nonlinear. And that's why when you see a collapse beginning like we're seeing today, this is not a gradual slide. It happens by a ratchet-type plunge. And people look around and they say, where the hell did this come from? And the answer is, if you've been listening to Lyndon LaRouche, you wouldn't be asking that question, because he warned of exactly this process that we're now seeing and is underway. It is the systemic collapse that's going on. On top of that, you have two other processes that are directly related to the systemic collapse and are pushing it in the direction of a complete collapse, but it's because we have this systemic breakdown going on that these things have the effect they do. One is the green reset policy, which is inducing a situation of forced cutbacks in energy and industry and everything that's required to keep a society going. So this is exacerbating the physical economic collapse at an accelerating rate. And then the other process also related is the one of speculation, which we were just describing, where you've got 1.7 or 8 quadrillion dollars chasing around the world speculating. And therefore, it's having the kind of effect that we're seeing here today. Now, Mark Carney, who's in favor of the Green Reset, has stated very clearly, yet again earlier this week, that the policy is straightforward. We have to change what he calls the plumbing of the international finance system to make sure that the plumbing takes the funds and the resources into a green speculative bubble of $150 trillion. Those are his numbers. And that makes sure as well, that plumbing does, that nothing goes to actual productive activity. That's the policy. And the Federal Reserve is in the process of making a major policy shift as well, adapting to this hyperinflationary blowout going on with the Depression collapse. There's no way they can adjust to anything that's going to actually function in any event. I want to conclude by reading a paragraph or two from Lyndon LaRouche from remarks he made on October 22nd, 2001. This is 20 years ago, so I meant it when I said people wouldn't be asking silly questions if they'd been listening to LaRouche. For the last 20 years, almost exactly 20 years ago, LaRouche said the following. He said, "The reason that I've been so successful in forecasting is because I think systemically. Therefore, I understand how a systemic collapse unfolds, as opposed to a stock market prediction, which is what every idiot likes to talk about. I make forecasts, not predictions. Forecasts which are based on the systemic characteristics and the boundary conditions within which the system operates. That's why I have always been right, and every one of my critics, whether inside the organization or outside, has always been wrong." And then he turns to explain very succinctly, 20 years ago, what's going on. He says, "So you have a situation globally, in the United States and outside, in which the total amount of debt service being extracted from the economies is increasing cancerously, and the debt service payment requirement accordingly. This is collapsing the actual productive power of nations and their populations, precisely at the time that the amount of debt to be paid is increasing. So there's no possible way that the present international monetary financial system could be continued without collapsing civilization into a generalized and prolonged new dark age, out of which most nations will disappear and the human population will drop rapidly during the course of this century to below 1 billion. And the first drop down will tend to be a big one. So therefore, we're in a situation in which anybody who doesn't support my proposals on bankruptcy reorganization of the international monetary and financial system, does not support the measures which I've proposed as required for this purpose, has to be an idiot." Close quote. The good news, of course, is that the solutions are at hand once this causal systemic process is recognized. Lyndon LaRouche's solutions, which we can discuss in the period that follows, are readily available and can be implemented. In fact, the Russians, the Chinese, and others are already on board. We're in a situation where, well, I was going to say we can turn on a dime. We're not going to be able to turn on a dime. We'll have to turn on a dollar because of the deflation of the dollar's value. But the change can be made, and it can be made quickly, and that's precisely what we're intent on bringing about.